Continuing this sort of topic of community, because we all have our own communities, don't we? We're all involved in different communities. You know, we've been developing our little family community with an addition with Levi. Now, what's funny, Judah, if I can say, I was always kind of his favourite. You know, if I left the room, Judah would, you'd know about it. You'd know about it. It'd be like, "Where's Dada going?" And that was really lovely. But it comes with its own challenges. Now, I don't know why, Levi is completely different. I feel like I'm like the lowest of the pecking order. It's like, if I'm there, that's all right. But it's nothing special. I feel like the grandparents, they actually come. They're like the favourites, you know. So you're doing well, Jane. But yesterday, right, before Esther was going out, she was just getting ready to go out. She was taking the boys, and she had Levi, and she was stood at the door just getting ready, and she's holding Levi, and I'm just sat on the sofa, and I'm like, "Oh, wave bye," and Levi, he goes, you know, he's reaching for, he's like, and I'm like, "What's going on here? Do you not want to leave? Do you want to stay with Dada?" And he's like, I'm like, "Well, this is unusual." I'm like, "What have I done to deserve this?" And then I realised, like I look down next to me, and I see his little cat Teddy, and I'm like, "Oh no, wait a minute!" I'm like, and I pick it up, and I'm like, "Is it this?" And he's like, so I stand up and take the Teddy to him. He has the biggest smile on his face. So I hand it to him, and like, I'm not kidding. He grips it, and then he just goes, gives me a little wave. So it was the Teddy. I thought for a second, I'm like, I've gone up in the ladder, but it was the Teddy. But it's funny seeing these how they grow and change, and that's like our little community. But we've all got communities, and this here church. The strange thing is the Bible, it says that the church community is very unique. There's almost nothing quite like it in the world where you look, there might be different groups or things taking place, but the church community is unique. Now, from the first little session, it's kind of an introduction, and we looked at some of the big thoughts of how, you know, it's us, isn't it? We are the church. You know, when we say that word, that term, church, maybe it can be very loaded for people. We might think of different things. Maybe we'll think of an old building, or maybe people in the community would think of an old building, or you know, maybe a vicar or something. I don't know. We say that word, and sometimes it has its own meaning in society. But actually, what the Bible says is that we are the church, and that it uses this image that each one of us is a building block. The same way a building is put together, we put the bricks down one by one, that actually we are those bricks, those building blocks. That's just living stone. Now, I got a little bit sociological, and whereas that's always Esther's forte, but apparently what some of the academics are saying is we're seeing, again, a shift, a pendulum shift. So, as we've sort of said in previous weeks, we're just recapping slightly, that over the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've been very interested in the material, and that is still there. But what the younger generation, what we're seeing is there's an interest in the spiritual. That makes sense. So in the metaphysical, something there's a desire there to experience that. Now, with that taking place, we're seeing an increase of local community will become more important as well. So it kind of puts us in an interesting time, because there's sort of two things going on. Local community is becoming more important to people, and the spiritual is becoming more important to the younger generation. So that's kind of a good time for the church, because that is an environment that really is covering both of those things, right? That's what the Bible says. We're a community, but we are involved in the spiritual. And I wanted to look a little bit more at that spiritual side of it today, because that is a huge, important part, isn't it, of our faith? You know, I laid out the introduction, some of the practical aspects, how it's quite good to be involved in a community, but that is really just the surface, because I don't know about you, but there's when you read the Bible, there is a huge emphasis, rightly so, on spirituality, right? But the topic is entirely mysterious as well. Because it's one of those things, the Bible talks about it a lot, but doesn't give us many details, right? Now, a few weeks ago, or was it last month, I tried to lay a foundation of God's ways being higher. Does anyone recall that? And I used, well, we've got Beth does, that's good. And I used the example of when I was over lockdown watching this live stream of these penguins, right? You remember, because it's kind of a silly example. There was like thousands of people tuning in to watch these penguins. And I posed this question, just trying to be a bit silly, but get us thinking. I posed the question, do you think the penguins had any idea what was taking place? Do you think those penguins knew that they were being watched by thousands of people through a live stream? And everyone was like, no. He's like, do we even need to answer that? I was poking at it, but being silly, because the point is, what I said, they're operating from a framework, aren't they? And it's not their fault. No one's going to have a go at the penguins for not understanding that. There's a framework in place. And there's a limit. They don't understand that there are cables going across the world where internet can go back and forth, data can go back and forth. They don't know that there's satellites in space. But all this stuff is taking place for us to be able to observe those penguins, and they had no idea that that was taking place. And it wouldn't matter if you were the smartest penguin in the world, or we'll say the least in the world. Does that make sense? It would make no difference, would it? We can probably all agree that it's just a different framework, a different level of operating. And I posed the question, because we've had enough of putting the penguins down, but then I posed it, are we not exactly the same though? Just a different phase. We have our own limitations. The Bible says that God's ways are higher than our ways. And to an extent, is that not just the same? That there are things taking place in the spiritual that are probably just far beyond our level of comprehension. But it doesn't change the fact that it's happening. Like those penguins, they don't understand the satellites and the data going across the world, but it's still true. It doesn't take away from the fact that that is happening. So I wonder, for us as a church, and when the Bible says that his ways are higher, what is taking place in the spiritual right now that maybe a big picture we can understand, but the details, they're far above what we know? Does that make sense? Yeah? See, the Bible, when it's talking about the spiritual, it does sometimes give us visions and imagery. Now, there's a lot of debate whether they're a literal representation or whether it's an image cast so that we can understand. But it does paint this picture. So one of the first examples, really well known in the book of Daniel, some of you know where I'm going, right? We're given this example where Daniel's prayers and fasting, right, makes a difference in let's say, the good powers getting through the bad powers. That's kind of a simplification, but that is sort of the position we're given, right? So Daniel's prayer and fasting made a difference to the good powers breaking through bad powers in the spiritual realm. Whatever that looks like, that's kind of a really simplified leaning into what we're kind of given. So what does that mean to you? Because that is an image we're presented with, that when we read that, what we're meant to see is that prayer and fasting is important, that it has some kind of effect. Does that make sense? In the spiritual, it has an effect. It's not just doing nothing, but there is something in the unseen that perhaps we can't perceive or grasp fully, but it is having an effect. Prayer and fasting. We're given another example in, this is 1 Kings 22, 19 to 23. We had to do a sort of an essay on this in Bible college, because it's a really interesting image taking place. And it's almost like you've got to imagine God in his throne room, whatever that would look like, the spiritual throne room, And it gives this image that God is talking to his spirits, right? He's sort of holding counsel, okay? And he's talking to his spirits. Now, there's a lot of historical biblical stuff going on here, and basically there's a plan. It's Old Testament. There's a plan to deceive Ahab, right, on earth. So we're given this really weird sort of interaction that scholars have been fascinated over for a long time, and God calls forth this deceptive spirit. But I know it sounds weird, but picture it, okay, because it's giving us an insight. So it's, who will deceive Ahab? And there's a deceptive spirit that steps forward. Isn't that strange? So the details might be pretty, we're not used to that, but we're given this, this image that there's a dialogue, there's an interaction, there's something taking place that perhaps we can understand in our minds, because we get the image of a king holding counsel, right? But it gives this image that God is doing the same. Because when we say the word God, who just thinks of a big ball of light somewhere? No one. Who thinks of a more, maybe there's a human form to it? I don't know what you people think of. We've got nothing. What do you think of? What do you think of, Jane?
A super being. I don't know.
Super being is. We probably all have some kind of different idea, don't we? When we say, what does God look like to you? But here we're given examples that we can understand that God is in charge of this heavenly realm. He's holding counsel, speaking to these spirits. And this is where some people they go into this and they look at the spiritual in the sense of the effect that it has on the world, that when we talk about things like greed and pride and things like that, there's a train of thought there which suggests that some of those things, it's not just a physical thing we're feeling, but actually when you go too far into those things, you're almost coming under a dominion or a spirit of that thing. Does that make sense? It's like a territory that we sort of step into, or an idea that we sort of step into. Does that make sense? The same way we might step into wisdom or to grace. See here, it's given this example of the lying, the deceptive spirit. I know it's strange, isn't it? I understand that. But it does give a big, broad picture of the spiritual realm. I think what we can take away from that is something is taking place, and it's probably beyond fully our level of comprehension. Right? We can get glimpses, we can have bits of understanding, but it's probably very difficult if someone says they are an expert on all things spiritual, because by our nature we're quite grounded in the physical. But there does seem to be a connection between the physical here and the spiritual, between our prayers, between our fasting, and what takes place, both in the spiritual and the physical. Does that make sense? I know we're a bit back and forth with this, but the church, it's two aspects, because there's this community right now, but there is this spiritual side to us on an individual and a corporate level. So if Daniel's prayers and fasting had an effect by himself, we have to wonder, when we stand together as a church, spiritually, as the Bible asks us to do, to stand unified, what does that do in the spiritual realm? What effect does that have on our locality? Right? Now, does anyone know what a shield wall is? Come on. Ford will, surely. So, for our medieval experts, it's probably not. George knows. So it's an old combat style technique, right? So it doesn't work today. But you got to think back in the day, when people have got bow and arrows and they're like, got all sorts of stuff and there's all kinds of things going on like that. There was a formation called the shield wall that soldiers would do, right? So first, let's just imagine we'll take you as an individual and we're going to stand you on a battlefield, right? How are you feeling? You've got a shield, you're all right, you got one. Now, in front of you, there's, let's say, a wall full of archers or something like that, and they're ready to just, unfortunately, as they did, rain down those arrows, right? Which the Bible says that kind of spiritually happens to us. But you're on your own with your shield. What do? You try your best, don't you? You hope. Now, what they would do, really clever, a formation of soldiers. They trained specifically for this, and their shields, some of them, they'd be cut in such a way that they could form a link, right? So you could have a front row that would protect from the front. You'd have the row behind that would sort of have an angle, so you'd be covering a certain angle. Then you could go further and further, and you could actually be covered completely. So that group of soldiers could completely march and take ground and be defended from the projectiles coming to them. Does that make sense? You think, well, what's he talking about? When I look at that, and I think of that imagery, that is the difference in the spiritual sense between standing alone and having your church community around you. Does that make sense? There is, it sounds so cliche, but there really is strength, both physically and spiritually, in a community. Now, for those who consume media or whatever, if you watch a TV program, it's a really common trope to have a character that's a bit of a lone wolf, right? They're like mysterious, and I always love those characters. I think, those characters are cool. They're a bit edgy. They're usually stood maybe at the side of the room with their arms crossed. They're not quite getting involved, and they'll have some sort of sarcastic comment when the character. You know the person I'm saying. You know the sort of character, yeah. So it can be really common for us to then think. A lot of people think, oh well, maybe that's me in my social circle. I'm just a little bit above what's going on here. I just do my own thing. I'm a lone wolf. I'm a ranger. You think you know what he's talking about. I always like those characters. But in reality, I recognize that's not a strong position to be in. In real life, in Christianity, in the church world, that is not a strong position. It actually makes you weaker. The lone wolf, it sounds cool. But actually, they're easy prey. They're easy pickings. The ones with a group around them, in a pack, in a community, they're so much stronger. Both physically and, I believe, spiritually. Why is it so important? Spiritually. I think because you've probably experienced, we can be a bit up and down, right? Some days maybe you're thinking, I'm feeling great. Me and God, we're like this, okay? And then other days you might be thinking, I am not feeling fearfully and wonderfully made. I am not feeling that through Christ I can do all things. And in those days, the strength of community carries us. Maybe I've been there, maybe we've all been there. There's just some days you do not feel mighty in God. Maybe you say your prayer, but you're thinking, I don't know, Lord, are you hearing me? In those weak times, our community, the spiritual, it's like that shield wall. It is the difference between you being stood alone as those arrows are flying over, and you're gripping your shield, but you're feeling a bit weary. You're kind of hoping for the best, and being in the midst of that shield wall, thinking, well, actually, I'm feeling weak. I'm feeling tired today, but I got my Jane to my left, who's holding a shield right there. I got my Tim to my right, and he's holding his shield there. I got my Beth in front of me. She's holding her shield there. And even though I'm not feeling it, right now, they're going to carry me. Does that make sense? Now I know each person has to make a decision to come to God. But when we're in the vine, sometimes the ecclesia, the church, the called out ones, it really helps. There can be this temptation to just go at it alone, to be that lone wolf. But all it takes is to be in a bad day. And if we're not proactive, that bad day might become an off week or an off month or an off year. And before we know it, we think, well, where am I spiritually? I've grown so cold and I haven't even realized it. Because we've become isolated. John 15, it talks about the vine and the branches. I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. But if we're not in the vine, what do we do? Because it's not us, it's not in and of ourselves, it's not our own strength. It is by being part of God, being part of the ecclesia. That is where the strength comes from. You are already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. It's such a well-known topic that we all kind of get it, but is something that we have to proactively engage in. Because if you were to ask anyone and say, is it important to be in God, to be in community? We'd all be like, yeah. But do we live like we believe that? I know hopefully most of us, because we're in church today, hopefully we do, but community, it is so important, physically and spiritually. What effect? What does this look like in the spiritual, I wonder? If you could just put on some goggles or glasses or something, you press a little button and you're seeing in the spiritual realm, what would this look like right now? Because unfortunately, we only see through our physical eyes, but I think we would see something amazing. Churches up and down the country, we would see something amazing. A light that this world needs. And each one of us, we carry a bit of that. And as we come together, it just gets brighter and brighter, doesn't it? A lone candle will keep a bit of darkness at bay, but 1,000 candles together will keep a lot more. Does that make sense? That he is the light, but we carry it. So when you engage in prayer, think about it. Think about it through the lens of the spiritual. That the Bible says that he hears it. That he hears it. But we can easily be discouraged. The parable of the sower, it gives us just a few examples of barriers that can affect us, right? The parable, you've got some seed and some's on rocky ground and not so good ground and some's on good ground. It gives us barriers. It says, well, what is actually stopping my heart from wanting to go deeper with this? What are some of those barriers? We've got, one could be trouble or persecution. That becomes a distraction for us. It could be anxiety or fear. That is a barrier that can stop us from going further. Not that we're expected to not have any of those things, but we hand it over to God, to walk with him through those things. We know that if it doesn't take root, it's easier to take out. You know, if Pam was here today, our master gardener, she would tell us, we have to let this within us take root or get deeper, get stronger. So community, both physically and spiritually, it matters. I believe there's victory in the covering. That, though it doesn't talk too much about it, there's a spiritual covering. And when we are in a church, in a community, and we've said, this is my family, that we are under that same covering. Does that make sense? As we are under the grand covering of Jesus, where we carry each other's burdens, lift each other up. What does that look like? We talked about the early church, a few weeks ago. What does that look like today? Because a lot of us, it's like the Christian thing. People say, oh yeah, I love the early church. Say, I want more of that. And you think, do you really? Do you know what you're asking for? Because they were completely the embodiment of a physical community carrying each other's burdens and spiritual together. Does that make sense? We're going to go into communion in a moment. And I want us to just take a minute to give thanks for the cross, what was done, but also to just, if we feel like we're in a state of routine or just, so here we go, we're doing this again, just try and take a minute, just intentionally try and break that and give thanks for the community you're in, the church community, and the spiritual things that are taking place. When you say your prayer in communion, I want you to just imagine, just think of that prayer going up into God's throne room, and he has it, and he sees it. Does that make sense? And to just believe that what I'm saying has an effect in the spiritual atmosphere. We're going to put this prayer up on the screen.